Wonderful. Thank you and welcome, everybody. I'm excited to welcome you for another occurrence of Resilience Reimagined, the Deans of the Embry-Riddle Worldwide College of Arts and Sciences speaker series with me, as you probably guessed, being the Dean of the college. So welcome. With this virtual speaker series, Resilience Reimagined, we once a month host esteemed guests to discuss fresh perspectives on a broad range of resilience topics. So we do not base this series on a particular definition of resilience, but this series supports our college's strategic vision to be a true destination college for multidisciplinary studies and impactful collaborative research, as we strive to transform our students and the broader community into responsive, responsible global citizens. And it also connects to a variety of pertinent academic degree programs that we offer, in particular through our Department of Emergency, Disaster, and Global Security Studies. I'm so excited that today we really have the honor, and Wes, thank you so much for joining us and welcome. We have the honor to host the Chief Resilience Officer of Florida, of our state of Florida. So Wesley Brooks, Ph.D., is the Chief Resilience Officer in the Florida Statewide Office of Resilience. He is a native of Miami. We envy you for that. And you have served since actually November 2029 as Florida's, like I said, Chief Resilience Officer, leading this statewide Office of Resilience on behalf of Governor Ron DeSantis to enhance agency coordination on resilience and bolster flood protection and mitigation efforts across inland and coastal communities throughout the state. Your talk is titled Resilient Florida, Strategies and Instruments. And Wes, you are also an appointed state representative to the South Florida Ecosystem Restoration Task Force Working Group. Very important, as we also have a program in human security and resilience here at our college, and chair of the multi-agency Florida's Coral Reef Coordination Team, with a primary research focus on invasive species and restoration ecology in South Florida. You earned your PhD in, with that focus in ecological science from Rutgers University. We also envy you for that. And bachelor's, and you also have a bachelor's degree in biology and political science, so we share that, from Duke University. Previously, Wes served as the Director of Federal Affairs for the Florida Department of Environmental Protection and also served as a Senior Advisor on Agriculture, Energy and Environment, Water Resources and Trade Policy to Senator Marco Rubio, Congressman Brian Mast, and Congresswoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen. So thank you for taking the time to talk to us today. And as always, I would encourage all attendees, as a courtesy to our speaker and to each other, to briefly, with a sentence or so, introduce yourselves in the chat. If you are in a degree program with us or elsewhere, point out that degree program. And if you care, also share where you are located so that we can assess the bandwidth of coverage here with this. And also, if you have any questions for Wes along the way, please don't hesitate to put those in the chat. And otherwise, as always, towards the end of this hour, we'll reserve a couple of minutes for you to also ask your question live. Without further ado now, Wes, please take it away. It's all yours, and thanks so much for coming today.
Thank you all so much for having me into Embry-Riddle and your program in general. It's always good to do these things, if only to hear that your biography is too long and probably needs to be cleaned up a little bit and a little tighter. So I really do appreciate the opportunity to be here with you. Your series is intriguing. It's called Resilience Reimagined, and in many ways, here in Florida, we're still imagining it for starters. So what I wanted to do really was make sure everybody understood the foundations for what we're doing in the state. And I thought that that would serve as a really a great jumping off point for questions and discussion at the end. So I'm gonna lay it all on you all from the 50,000 foot level, and we can go from there. Um, I think importantly, we need to start with a definition of our work. For us at the Statewide Office of Resilience, we really view flood mitigation and resilience activities as a means to improve quality of life for fellow Floridians, acting both through expanded economic opportunity and enhanced environmental vitality. This is important because we try to be humble enough to understand that while flooding is a really important and can be a really severe impact on individuals, most of the time people aren't being impacted by flooding, aren't experiencing flooding, and there are other things going on in people's daily lives that really come to the forefront. And so as I said, we try to keep ourselves humbled to that, and also find ways to make sure that our activities boost what people do in their daily lives. Picture's worth 1,000 words, and this is exactly the kind of a project that I mean. This is from Fernandina Beach. And again, exactly the kind of work that we're looking to support and encourage. You can see the Port of Fernandina Beach in the background. So massive economic sector for Northeast Florida right there. You have public access to the water, which is a driving force for why so many people choose to live in, choose to stay in Florida. You have some living shoreline, which is providing environmental benefits, providing habitat for smaller fish species, prey species, and crustaceans. You have some green-gray hybrid infrastructure protecting the coast and berm from erosion. You have a recreational trail for residents to be able to use for their own benefit, for their enjoyment, for their health and well-being. And then even beyond that, as we move inland further, you have an additional 2 to 3 foot flood wall, supplementary flood wall, where the city can come in and put gates into the access points and provide an extra layer of flood protection for storm surge and things like that. This is just such an excellent embodiment of the kind of work that we're looking to support. And so that's a coastal example. Here's an inland example. Also, this is from Escambia County in far northwest Florida. The neighborhood that you can sort of see peeking out in the background had no formalized stormwater system, kind of just ditches along the side of the road. Neighborhood was several decades old, had sort of been run down. And the county took this as an opportunity to not only improve the stormwater system, but also to create a recreational amenity and an environmental amenity for the community. Not only has this improved, flooding situations along the neighborhood roads, it's also made the neighborhood more appealing and more attractive because those ditches along the side of the road are gone. People have better access in and around the neighborhood to walk. They have this amenity that they can go to. And the county tells me that they have anecdotal evidence that they believe this has driven a reduction in crime, actually, in the neighborhood because residents are out and about more frequently and interacting with one another in more positive ways. Plus, you're getting stormwater treatment and environmental benefits for the stormwater that otherwise might run off into streams and the watershed more quickly than they do today. So those are the kinds of projects that we're really looking to to push forward multi-use, multi-beneficial projects. But where did this all come from? Where does it all stem from? Well, there's some really important state policy foundations that undergird everything that we're doing. And resilience has always been a fact of life in Florida, as has adaptation. Modern Florida would not look anywhere near as clogged with traffic and people had it not been for folks worried about flooding and flood mitigation. And that's pretty much statewide. But what we didn't have before was really kind of a centralized or really strategic view of resilience. That I would argue that changed in 2019. Governor DeSantis, in his second day in office, issued Executive Order 1912, which really laid out his first term environmental objectives. And a really important seed for this entire movement was the governor took all of the coastal programs within the Department of Environmental Protection and also added sort of a nascent focus on resilience. And that reorganization yielded the Office of Resilience and Coastal Protection at DEP. A couple months later in the fall, the governor also created the Chief Resilience Officer position within the Executive Office of the Governor, the first statewide position dedicated to resilience in Florida, and probably only the second or the third overall in the United States. Since that time, there are now I have about 12 to 15 colleagues, depending on how you define the role. But I give the governor a ton of credit for being an early visionary of the importance of this work to modern life in Florida in particular. The other key piece of this is that the position was housed within the Executive Office of the Governor. Many of my peers across the United States are actually housed in a state agency like a Department of Environmental Protection. And I think that actually really hampers some of their ability to work across state government and move a lot of various siloed authorities and responsibilities into synchrony. In 2021, the legislature really got involved, and a lot of credit to former Speaker Chris Sprowls from the Tampa Bay region, Pinellas County in particular. They passed what was known then at the time as the Always Ready Bill, and it really established this Resilient Florida framework that I'll go over in a moment. It includes a variety of Resilient Florida grant programs and activities. It established the Florida Flood Hub for Applied Research and Innovation at the University of South Florida. And it also created a method of payment in the Resilient Florida Trust Fund. So when I talk about the Resilient Florida Framework, this is what I'm talking about. It's housed within the aforementioned Office of Resilience and Coastal Protection. And really four main pieces to this. Planning grants, which are 100% state funded for local communities, that helps them put together critical asset inventories and vulnerability assessments. The statewide resilience plan is a 50% state cost-shared grant program that provides dollars to accelerate infrastructure improvements and mitigate those vulnerabilities that are found in those vulnerability assessments. The statewide data set and assessment actually pulls in the data from all of the local vulnerability assessments and creates sort of an apples to apples comparison across some very diverse regions of the state, allowing us to better prioritize needs and risk and look at risk across the state. And then also these regional resilience entities are designed to provide another layer of support to local governments, but also to enable a cooperative environment for local governments to move in concert together towards more regional solutions or regional frameworks, so that in this way, their individual solutions aren't necessarily cutting against one another. And then really important is the foundation to all of this work really is tied up in up-to-date, realistic, and consistent standards and projections of compound flooding. You need lots of data. You need sophisticated modeling. And really that's what the Florida Flood Hub is designed to do, is to not necessarily do all that work themselves, but to serve as the coordination point for all of the entities doing this work and bring it all together in a place that is accessible, and again creates a standardized foundation for every local government and state agency to work from. In 2022, I guess the legislature had seen some of our early efforts and saw the benefit in the CRO position and what it could do for the state. And so they codified it into state law, meaning that future administrations beyond the current one will also have the authority and responsibility to have a chief resilience officer. The CRO now heads the Statewide Office of Resilience, and I'll talk a little bit about what we do at the Statewide Office of Resilience specifically. And then I also want to point to another theme that's going to emerge through the rest of these slides as well, where obviously DEP and the Resilient Florida program, I would say, is the flagship resilience program in the state. But you're going to see the legislature start to broaden the agencies that are really tasked with, paying more explicit attention to resilience. And you're also going to see a deepening of resilience into their authorities and responsibilities as well. So the next agency after DEP that was sort of touched in state law was the Florida Department of Transportation. And they got tasked with a triennial resilience action plan that we'll touch on in a second as well. When we talk about the Statewide Office of Resilience, I really look at it as having two main missions. The first is leading interagency coordination on resilience and mitigation for state agencies in particular. So I work with all of these agencies. I think FDOT makes a ton of sense for everybody in terms of making sure that evacuation routes and transportation corridors are resilient and accessible, as often as possible. We mentioned DEP and the Office of Resilience and Coastal Protection. Division of Emergency Management actually manages all of the FEMA federal mitigation grants, especially after disaster situations. Florida Commerce manages HUD disaster grants, mitigation grants, like community development block grants. And then FWC, not only do they play a role in terms of managing some of our natural habitats, in which case, we can bolster our natural infrastructure, specifically to coastal infrastructure. They also manage the of vessel removal program. So when you have derelict vessels that go into mangroves, for instance, FWC is the one tasked with pulling those vessels out, and clearly that's really important for maintaining the health of those really critical coastal communities that help our flood resilience. The water management districts clearly are leaders in terms of flood data collection and flood modeling. They are regionally responsible for maintaining flood control systems in their area and also water supply. And then I would say one that folks forget about all the time, but really shouldn't, is the Department of Business and Professional Regulation. So they manage licensing requirements for engineers and other fields that really do help support local governments in designing, planning, implementing resilience projects from the private sector. But they also have the Florida Building Commission within them, and the nation's most stringent building code for both windstorm and flood protection. So it's a really key piece of our resilience efforts. And altogether, under Governor DeSantis's time in office, I would argue we have more than $9 billion in resilience investments moving through these agencies. If you also want to consider the governor's historic investments in water quality and ecosystem restoration, then you're looking at about $15.5 billion or so over the last 5 to 6 years, which is a really incredible number, and I think speaks to really the movement within state government to prioritize these issues. The other kind of leg of what my office does is to be there in support of local communities. I mean it quite literally when I say we meet communities where they are. I've been to every single county in the state, multiple times, and frequently meet with local elected officials, county administrators, town managers, departmental folks, anybody engaged in resilience at the local level. It's really important for me to understand what their goals are for their community and help link them up with resources at the state level. And not just resources, but the right person in the right place at the state level, which is really difficult sometimes for local communities. I work hand in hand with DEP on implementation of the Resilient Florida Framework. I also deal directly with advancing a lot of those large state ecosystem restoration projects, as was mentioned in my bio, whether it's Everglades restoration, Florida's coral reef, uh, coastal work, and riverine work as well. Very much engaged in making sure that at a statewide level, we're being very conscientious about how we manage and restore these ecosystems. And then at a local level, we're always trying to lower barriers to the use of nature-based features and natural infrastructure in these projects as well. And then finally, we work very closely at all level of government, local, regional, state, and federal, to try to facilitate strategic partnerships. A great example of that is we've been working very closely with the Department of Defense for several years now to secure and co-fund military installation reviews around the state. We have all but two of our installations now potentially covered by these. They're essentially vulnerability assessments for the communities surrounding the installations, and it allows us to later access implementation funding. Right now, we're funding some work in the Space Coast actually to get some extra water supply lines in to Space Force Base there at Patrick. We are also working on moving and sort of improving advanced wastewater treatment around the Northern Indian River Lagoon as well. And these are all projects that help support the long-term mission of DoD in Florida, but at the same time, they benefit our local communities greatly in all the same ways I talked about before. And part of what we've also done is we've worked with DoD to essentially align their standards with our state standards for vulnerability assessments. And so in the process, we now, when local communities apply for implementation projects, they can use federal and state matches to cover their entire portion of the project cost. So it really opens up new avenues for local communities to make some important progress on these issues. I mentioned FDOT resilience planning before. The Resilience Action Plan came out in 2023, and it was really an exposure analysis of different flood factors that may impact the state highway system. The next RAP is due in 2026, and they're going to take it the next level and actually look at all the engineering that they use along the state highway system to assess which portions of the roadway, which segments are actually vulnerable to the exposure that's been identified here. So stay tuned for that. In 2023, the governor issued a second executive order, this time highlighting his commitments to Florida's environment through his second term. And as far as we know, this is the first time that any governor has issued an executive order with an explicit direction regarding resilience. And I'll go through some of the pieces of that in the following slides. I also want to point out there is a section of Florida statute that required a sea level impact projection study when publicly financing construction projects within extreme coastal areas of the state. And that was sort of its own standalone thing. The legislature actually brought that into sort of the Resilient Florida section of the code and helped align it with Resilient Florida standards for some of those projections. So again, we're trying to streamline and make sure that standards are consistent across all the different pieces of state government, and so that we enable local governments to be more successful. With regards to the EO, a really important acknowledgement for our coastal communities and the importance of our beach and dune systems for the state as a frontline defense against sea level rise and coastal flooding. With this at our back, we were able to secure $206 million after Hurricane Ian and Hurricane Nicole from the state legislature in order to completely fulfill this recovery plan for those storms. Obviously, we've been challenged since then, and I think you might see something similar emerge in the coming year after the last set of storms. The governor also directed myself and DEP to ensure that every community in the state of Florida had a comprehensive flood vulnerability assessment aligned with Resilient Florida standards by the end of his time in office, 2026. And so I learned at that moment that there are not just 67 counties, but also 411 municipalities in the state of Florida. And so we've been hard at work the last couple of years, making sure that we are tapping into those Resilient Florida planning grants to give every community a fair chance to get this important work done. I'm proud to say all 67 counties are in some level of progress towards this goal, with many already done. And 90% of those 411 municipalities are also somewhere in the pipeline. I'm also expecting another planning grant announcement from DEP sometime in the next week or two, and that will actually get us above 95% of communities in the pipeline to identify all of their critical assets and critical infrastructure that are now or may be at risk of flooding within the next 50 years. So, and we will be the first state in the country to have anywhere near this level of detail on flood vulnerability of critical infrastructure. So given our size, it's actually really impressive. Now, all of that vulnerability data at the end of the day is great, but you want it to yield projects. And so the governor's executive order also directed us to continue to seek funding for the statewide resilience plan. And so here are the state's investments that are being catalyzed right now just from the Resilient Florida program. And I'll just go to the big number, right? Almost $3 billion in 4 years that this program has been in existence. It's really been an incredible, incredible asset for the state, and will be making some dramatic impact in the near future as all these projects come online. 300 planning grants, almost 350 implementation grants. It's far exceeded what any of us expected when the legislation first passed. So credit to the governor and to the legislature for putting their money where their mouth is on this. A couple of things I would just point out to everybody to notice. You see a lot of the green dots are clustered around major population centers along the coast. That's not an accident. These happen to be the communities that already had, investments in place in terms of understanding vulnerability, might have had projects on the shelf, just waiting for the right right application period to open. And Resilient Florida has really been a boon to these areas in moving their resilience portfolio of projects forward. What I'm especially proud about, though, is those golden dots that are, again, by the governor's directive, going to be touching every single community across the state. You can see that they're filling in all the gaps in between the green. This is really important, and it's really the way the program has been comprehensively designed to step governments, local communities from planning into implementation. And so as soon as they have those vulnerability assessments done, they're able to apply for actually trying to mitigate the vulnerability to the assets that they've found. So I think you will see those green dots will start to spread more and more across the inland, interior, and rural areas of the state. And that's really important because every community has resilience opportunities waiting. Mentioned ecosystem restoration. This one's a really exciting one for us in particular. The Florida's Coral Reef Restoration and Recovery Initiative aims to sort of follow Everglades restoration, right? We are with the reef kind of where Everglades restoration was in the late 80s, early 90s. Not only are we working towards restoring, the environmental resources, to building up the maritime economy, both in terms of resources like fisheries, but also tourism. We're pinning all of the work by prioritizing reef restoration in areas that will make the most impact on reducing flood risk for coastal communities along Southeast Florida. And essentially, we are building a new maritime industry in the process that hopefully one day the state will benefit from exporting to other areas of the world as well. So it's very exciting, and we're working towards building that up. We've had historic levels of funding for coral reef management and restoration over the last 2 years, in part because of this announcement, and we're looking to build on that next year. Just this past legislative session, we made some refinements to Resilient Florida programs. We've sort of watched the way the program had worked for a couple of years, and we had some ideas for where it needed to go. And so, we worked very hard with the legislature to sort of meld what it had been into what it needs to be. So I feel really good about that. We also had the Seminole Gaming Compact revenue sharing bill come through, which essentially sets aside more than $400 million a year towards essentially resilience and mitigation activities. A lot of the land conservation and management programs have benefits for resilience and flood mitigation. And there's $100 million a year earmarked to supplementally fund the statewide resilience plan and implementation projects across the state. And then, again, the broadening and deepening of resilience across the state. Flood disclosure and My Safe Florida Home program, I think, represents a really important moment where, we're not just thinking about public infrastructure and public programs, but we're looking for ways to incentivize private property owners to engage in resilience, within their own hyper-local level. And so that's really important going forward as well. Government can't do it all. We certainly need individuals making good, resilient decisions themselves. And of course, all of this was happening with the backdrop of 6 hurricanes over my 3 years as CRO. It's not exactly how I would have written the script, but we've made do the best we can. And so I'd like to share for you some of what we've learned through that process, and kind of again talk about how we're sort of blending these lessons into all of that policy foundation and programming that we're doing. So Ian, Nicole, Idalia, Debbie, Helene, and Milton. The quite an amazing set of 6 storms. First off the bat is, again, pictures say 1,000 words, and the flooding is often sensational. But it's rarely surprising. You may have some cases to make on some of the rain bombs. I think about the one in Broward County last year, in particular, that ended up with about almost 4 feet of water on Fort Lauderdale Hollywood International Airport. That one was very sensational. But in general, here's some, this is not the final data, but some of the early data from the ISI looking at the 3 hurricanes from this year. And anybody looking at this map can see geography in action. Fact of the matter is, flooding goes where the geography, basically tells it to. So the important lesson here is that with the right data, with the right understanding, we know what's likely to flood, and we can and should plan around that. We also find that structural impacts from flooding are strongly correlated with the year built, whether it's critical assets and infrastructure or really residential communities. This is just a front doorstep in Orlo Vista in the Orlando area, Southern Orange County. And this area was built in the 1960s and 1970s. Some really wild stuff happening back then in the 60s and 70s. And we're still paying for it today in many respects. This particular neighborhood was built in a rather low-lying spot. And then other development decisions over time basically, cut it off from a lot of outflow opportunities, and basically made it a little suburban bowl in an urban area. And you can see the water line kind of on the doorway, extending up quite a bit for a relatively flat neighborhood. Some of this area had 4 or 5 feet of flooding, because the one stormwater pond in the center of it couldn't handle all the inflow. Thankfully, we've worked with the Division of Emergency Management in Orange County, and actually this neighborhood performed really well with the new expansion of the stormwater capacity that we sponsored. So we can retrofit some of these issues, but it's really important, in my mind, to get ahead of these things as often as possible. But again, we're not going to be able to avoid retrofitting a lot of the structures, especially those built in the 60s and 70s. Natural infrastructure also provides real flood mitigation benefits. This is from Levy County, which unfortunately was struck by quite a number of storms in recent years, when it was probably one of the least hit areas that we know of in state history anyway. And there is a mitigation benefit of having this natural habitat here versus having homes right on the water. And here's just a sense of what that habitat faced from this was Hurricane Helene, looking at 14 to 18 feet of inundation right along the coast from storm surge. And so the habitats took a walloping, but they are pretty resilient, and they saved a lot of money and lives by being there, and buffering other development further inland. Also, an important key right now is based on what we are seeing, economic damages are largely explained by land use development and population growth patterns. There was a really interesting article that came out in the Washington Post just about a month and a half ago. And I would say it matched with Florida's lived experiences quite well. Climate impacts are expected to create more challenges for for resilience in the future. But we're not seeing those things actually make an impact, in particular with hurricanes right now, on the damages that we're seeing. And so you can see here, when you adjust for inflation, population, and wealth, you are not seeing a trend in hurricane damages across the United States. And again, looking at it a little bit of a different way, where you are seeing a strong correlation is in population in coastal counties and in wealth in coastal counties with rising economic damages associated with hurricanes. A lot of that population and a lot of that wealth is coming right to Florida. And I also need to mention that public infrastructure failures, again, while sensational, are not always engineering failures. I've got to back up our professionals out there that are working in state agencies in the private sector. Here's a great example of what the lay person might view as an engineering failure. But when you actually, get on the ground and understand what occurred here, this is a county road, pretty far away from any real density, obviously supports some agricultural production. But this blew out in an area where there were some culverts for a very small stream. And this particular stream roadway crossing is 1 mile upstream from the Peace River. This is right after Hurricane Ian. It turns out the massive historic crest from Hurricane Ian actually pushed floodwaters upstream, right? This is from water going backwards upstream that blew this out. Not really a scenario that we would have, could have, or should have planned for in this particular case. And also, thankfully, road repair work like this is actually pretty inexpensive compared to some other kinds of damages that can be sustained. And what does this kind of point us to? Well, a policy goal of eliminating flood risk isn't really practical or economically feasible. You don't know how many county roads and how many miles upstream of the Peace River you would have to sink millions or billions of dollars in to make sure that they would never flood or be damaged by a Hurricane Ian or greater type storm. Instead, we are really focused on collecting as much of the low-hanging fruit as possible, and also lowering the intensity and duration of flood impacts as much as possible, rather than eliminating flood risk per se. Much of the state would actually benefit from watershed or basin level flooding assessments and high resolution modeling. The water management districts have been working on this in piecemeal fashion, some more successfully than others. But again, this is really one of our hopes for the Florida Flood Hub is to serve as a central node in figuring these problems out. Tom Frazier is there standing in the white shirt in front of the screen. He's the executive director. And we actually hosted a workshop with the Florida Silver Jackets program, bringing in folks from all the water management districts. And we are working on putting together an inventory of all the what should be publicly accessible flood modeling in the state, housing a repository of that information, not necessarily the modeling itself, but the information about the modeling within the Flood Hub, and serving as sort of a one-stop shop for anybody interested in flood data or flood modeling to come in, look at it in one place in a comprehensive fashion, and then be able to easily get to the folks who own and manage that data or that modeling to exercise use of it. And so one of the products that we're working on, and this is just a sample right now, but we should have this project done in the next couple of months, is building a dashboard that's going to be hosted at the Flood Hub as the initial start of that, where the public, state agencies, local governments are going to be able to go onto this dashboard and identify the basins and watersheds in the state that have some level of modeling data or model coverage available, learn more about the characteristics of those modeling efforts, and again, get connected directly with who manages those resources. It's a very, very cool project. And it's also going to allow us to be able to understand where we have gaps, and ideally, we will start to make some progress in not only filling those gaps, but filling those gaps in a coordinated fashion, where we're sort of standardizing again the kinds of information and the data quality that's needed to really support these models statewide. I think it's also important to mention that adaptation efforts can pay for themselves if they're planned and executed correctly. That's a big if, and you can under adapt or over adapt. We really want to make sure that we use information effectively, so that we're providing good, sustainable solutions for communities. And key to all of that is to make sure that we are creating and preserving the economic activity and wealth that is a necessary precondition to fund this work. We need to promote early investments that end up providing long-term savings and benefits. From a conservation perspective, I think it's pretty clear for any of you who've spent any time at all in the state that there really are significant opportunities remaining to preserve and improve floodplain function and stormwater management. This is borne out in our grant data for the DEP Resilient Florida program, where just a little over half of all the projects being funded right now are supporting stormwater enhancements. Here's one such project that could be being funded by the Seminole Gaming Compact, right in the shadow of the guitar. And again, this is a pretty low cost retrofit, providing enhanced stormwater removal to a new outfall that won't allow the storm system to get backed up in the way it was before. But we really want to move to a more proactive approach as much as possible. And it's easier said than done in certain areas, obviously, like urbanized Florida, but up north or inland, I think there are real opportunities for proactive resilience projects to serve as economic development opportunities. And here's one such project from the Panhandle near the old town of Santa Rosa. This old timber plantation that came into public ownership, and basically to the south of this map is an economic district that they wanted to actually create a more sustainable stormwater system and avoid or encourage more investment and development in that area specifically. But previously, they just had drainage ditches, and those drainage ditches took water straight out to Choctawhatchee Bay, which is a critical environmental resource to the north. And so they got a $15 million Resilient Florida grant to essentially create a massive stormwater facility on some of the old timberland. So they're promoting economic development, reliable, flood-free economic development to the south. They're slowing down the deposition of stormwater into Choctawhatchee Bay with this facility. So they're getting water quality improvements to the north. And they've created this recreational space for residents, including an amphitheater and hiking and walking trails, biking trails. Just an amazing example of how an inland or rural community can actually promote economic development and quality of life through a proactive approach to resilience. Tied to all of this as well is, we need to conserve natural and working landscapes. They are a critical insurance policy for the ongoing growth we're experiencing, as well as, I showed that Washington Post article that demonstrating that climate impacts may not necessarily be accounting for a lot of economic damages now, but certainly if you look at the IPCC reports, we're expecting that they will create a growing share of concern moving forward in the next 50 to 100 years as well. So having places that are not built up that can take and infiltrate water and move water away from people is really critical. So whether that's our renowned spring systems, whether that's citrus groves, whether that's ranch lands, we have just amazing opportunities to do that. Anywhere that's dark green in this map for the Florida Wildlife Corridor, which was just recently authorized by the legislature, is resilience and mitigation landscape that we can count on for the long term. It's these lighter green areas that are really the focus. These are providing mitigation and resilience benefits now, but aren't assured to be there in the decades to come. And so we really support the governor and the legislature's efforts to try to bring more of those light green areas into protection, so that we can continue to rely on those ecosystem services and flowways to keep flooding away from people. And again, part of that too is working with landowners to better value the services derived from their land management, so that we can create that necessary flexibility for long-term resilience. This obviously happens on the landscape scale, and this is a timber plantation in Levy County that's been really impacted by recent hurricanes. And, we are working with various state agencies to try to make sure that we can sustain that kind of production industry, so that it doesn't become something else that is less helpful for our resilience needs. But I think it's equally important in urban and suburban areas to think about, all the micro spaces that are available to take some of the demand off of stormwater systems in particular. So really, really interested in working with local governments in trying to find out where we can advance more projects, even as simple as this little swale, in order to, kind of aggregate a bunch of benefits, even in urban areas. So I'll stop there, and we can go into comments and questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Wes. That has been so comprehensive and also illustrative, and we can be proud of the state of Florida and what it does also in trailblazing public policy initiatives. And you mentioned the governor's executive order. That's the first order of a governor and only for the time being, as we understand, really being focused on resilience, and also the tiers of governance within the state, and the translation of the whole community approach to the state level. So this is an insightful and also thought-provoking presentation and topic. And we have a couple of feedback, but then also items, but then also questions in the chat. And maybe I can just summarize, and then as you see fit, Wes, maybe you could start with maybe 7 minutes left after, you could respond to those, and we could still see if we have any live questions. So let me read out some summaries, and maybe you can provide a comprehensive response, because one by one probably will let us time out. So one question is, are you aware of any plans or policies in place to mitigate overdevelopment at the city or county level? Volusia County is seeing rapid unmitigated growth in recent years, and inland flooding and wildlife displacement have been a huge issue that arguably has been largely ignored by the local government. So that's number one. Number two, as someone who has done many vulnerability analysis, predominantly for airports and disaster preparedness. This is Kat Moran, who leads our Master of Science in Human Factors program, actually. These analyses are only as effective and as is the reliability and comprehensiveness of the data. Can you speak to best practices in data collection in your field of responsibility for resilience in Florida? Number two.
Sure. I can chime in on those two real quick
Sounds good.
before we go on.
Go ahead.
So
Yeah.
On the first question on development in local government. So it's a complicated issue. One of the things that we're very proud of in this program that again I think is really different from similar programs that are being started in other places in the United States is we take a very bottom-up approach to resilience. So I'm a really big believer in if you want effective, sustainable solutions for resilience, you have to have community buy-in. The community has to be able to envision their future in the project and want to invest in it. And so we take a very hands-off approach in terms of telling local governments what they should or shouldn't be doing. We provide resources, and obviously there is some scoring and ranking criteria associated with the Resilient Florida program in particular, but we really try to stay out of the business of telling local governments what they need to do. I know that may be a shock for some people watching what Tallahassee does, but in the resilience space, we really do stick to that. I think that your observations on that front are not necessarily wrong. And it's something that communities just have to work through as they figure out what works and what doesn't work for them. But I think there are many examples also across the state of communities doing it well and in ways that are beneficial to them. And I would point to Charlotte County as a great example that's kept them out of trouble from some recent monster storms because of how good they've been on guiding development away from more vulnerable areas. In terms of the question on vulnerability analyses, absolutely garbage in, garbage out. Yes. Again, even here, we've largely so far been relying on local governments and their engineering consulting firms, right? In terms of providing that data that then goes into the statewide data set. But we've also used all of that as an opportunity, right? As we're aggregating all of this data to look and see what's being reported, how it's being reported, and we're beginning across DEP, myself, and the Flood Hub to look at that and start making recommendations for how that data should start being reported into the future going forward, because these vulnerability assessments they can be updated as often as possible, but it's recommended about every 5 to 10 years. And so I think just like in the model inventory that I mentioned as well, part of the problem with setting standards is you need to know what's even out there. You need to know why folks are using the data they're using, what the goals are, how they plan on using the data. And only then, once we sort of have a comprehensive view of what's there, I think can we make good decisions for how to actually generate improvements in that data and the analyses that come out of it. So that's a work in progress.
Thanks, Wes. Maybe we can also take the remaining two questions from the chat together. So one, how does the rise in water temperature impact your coral reef intervention? And second, relating to the Safe Florida Home program, you mentioned incentives. Other than the obvious incentive of having a safe home, what are the incentives associated with these programs?
Sure. So on the first one, obviously, and for those that don't know, temperature stress, Florida's coral reef is actually one of the most northern reefs, right, in the Atlantic Ocean. So temperature stress is a big deal that constrains coral populations kind of at the edge of the range, both on the heat side and on the cold side. We've had some really bad cold weather events. I think the last one was in 2011, and so they're sort of getting hit on both sides from thermal stress. But one of the ways we're looking to mitigate that, especially long term on the heat side, is this notion of breeding more resilient strains of corals. And so that's definitely part of our focus, is to take the very wide genetic diversity that we still have left in some of these populations and actually bring those coral genotypes that are more resilient to these particular types of stressors. And it's not just temperature, right? It's also disease, it's turbidity. There's a whole variety of different things. And have at our disposal a much better understanding of lineage of the different strains in our culture. And then we can also play around with what sites we restore particular strains to and things like that. So really getting very, very high tech, both on the genetic side as well as the actual restoration side in water. So that's really exciting work, honestly. And then just for the MySafe Florida Home program, we talked about, or I mentioned earlier, right? We can't eliminate all flood risk. To me, one of the most important thing, we need to assure that critical infrastructure is protected, but we also need to keep water out of people's homes, right? I mean, that's just like a critical fact of living in Florida. People shouldn't be subjected to intrusion of water into their homes. And so the MySafe Florida Home program is on the wind side. But one of the benefits of it is you get up to $10,000 that you can match with your own money, of a grant that allows you to target specific investments that have high payoff from a mitigation standpoint. And that you bring an inspector, they identify what those things are, you pay for the investments, you get another inspection to prove that they've been done, and then you see a benefit on your home insurance, on your insurer premium later on that also helps pay down some of your own investment alongside the state investment in your home. And I'm actually really, really excited. The Division of Emergency Management just last week announced the creation of the Elevate Florida program, which is going to do something similar, but on the flood mitigation side. So it's going to support elevations, it's going to support mitigation reconstruction, and it's going to support targeted acquisitions when homeowners are in a bad place financially. And I think that's going to kind of bring similar incentives to the flood side. It'll be a little more complicated on the flood insurance side because for most people, that's NFIP rather than a private insurer. But we are already looking at whether we can get some CRS benefits associated with moving this program forward and sort of get broad scale NFIP premium reductions for communities that are, seeing a lot of use in this.
So with that, we are past the hour. I believe we need to leave it at that. I just wanted to say, if you're attending and don't know a lot about our college yet and would like to learn more, the Department of Emergency, Disaster, and Global Security Studies is closest to this topic here and a good place to start with. The link is in the chat. Also, if you like to be, informed about future and similar offerings, on the bottom, on the top right, actually, you can click on the LinkedIn button icon and follow us on LinkedIn to stay in touch. So Wes, thank you so much. This has been so insightful, also very closely connected to our vision of, among everything else that we do, contribute as a college to fostering positive change, starting in the state we are located, which is Florida, while we save, while we serve the rest of the country and the rest of the world as well. But we are proud to be located in Florida with our Embry-Riddle Worldwide headquarters. So thanks, Wes, and thanks all for attending. If I don't talk to you before, continue to have a wonderful holiday season and a happy new year. And we'll hope to see you again next year in one or the other of our events. So once again, thank you. Take care. Thanks for coming. Take care. Be safe. Be good. And see you again. Bye-bye.